So, ethics in computing is a huge field. Entire courses are devoted to it, and books have been written. Entire professional codes exist, such as the ACM Code of Ethics. But today we're going to talk about situations that you're more likely to face in your career. And these are not just abstract philosophies, they're choices that you're likely to face, and sometimes without warning. So let's make it simple and divide it into situations into two categories. The first are issues that you come up with project work when you're developing or deploying systems. And the second are issues that come up in operations, meaning your day-to-day activities of your professional life. Let's begin with project work. So one common temptation is something called a backdoor. And a backdoor is a hidden way into a system known only to you that the developer creates, usually for debugging or to help with customer support. On its surface, it seems harmless because you're just trying to save time and you're logging in as another user to just to see exactly what they see. But the problem is that backdoors are never part of the customer's actual requirements. And once they exist in code, they become liable to attack. Hackers love backdoors because they bypass all the protections that you work so hard to build. And the ethical and professional solution is simple. You just don't do it. Do not create a backdoor. Instead, you need to build proper administrative tools that use real authentication and authorization. Another scenario is avoiding licensing fees, because you might think that it's just a small library, no one will notice, or this company makes billions of dollars and they don't need, a little more money. But the truth is that using software without paying for it is theft. And you're cheating the vendor and you're shifting the cost to honest customers if you do that. So think about it this way. Imagine you build your own product and begin making sales, and then a customer decides to make copies and hand them out. That would be your livelihood disappearing. Or imagine that you set up a company and you slip a third-party tool into your product without telling the finance people about the licensing fee. And maybe you save a few dollars in the short term, but if the vendor finds out, your company could be sued and you could lose your job, if not, a lot of extra money that you could have saved by just doing the right thing up front. The rationalizations are easy, but the damage is very real. And I've got some real world examples for you to read about in my courses about this. There are other unethical practices in project work. Spyware is another example where you secretly collect user data. And hacking is another one where someone tries to get into your system for bragging rights. Sometimes people justify these behaviors by saying that they're just for the greater good or just for fun, but in reality they erode trust and they put users at risk, and not to mention they could end your own career. So in my courses, check out the document with examples of actual backdoors, licensing disputes, and monitoring scandals from companies that you've heard of. I want you to review it after watching this lecture. Now let's shift to operations and the things that happen in your daily work. Because as IT professionals, you often have access to sensitive information that might include things like email logs, browsing histories, or system activities. And sometimes management may even ask you to monitor another employee's activities. But here's the legal baseline, because in the United States, courts have ruled that what happens on company equipment or company time belongs to the employer. Employers have the right to monitor it. But the purpose behind that monitoring matters. Looking into someone's account out of curiosity is not legitimate, or digging on dirt of a coworker is not legitimate, and selling information is absolutely not legitimate. So the only valid to access this kind of information is when there's a legitimate business purpose. Otherwise, you're crossing the line. And here's the difficult part. Sometimes the request comes from your boss or a colleague, and that's where your professional judgment and your backbone really matter. So let's also talk about responsibility. There's two situations that come up again and again, and the first is when you observe illegal activity, and the second is when you knowingly build insecure systems. because in both cases, you are not just a bystander. Your actions or your silence has consequences for users and your company and your profession. So consider the case of Equifax in 2017. Their system contained a known security flaw in the Apache struts. A patch that had already been released by the company failed to apply it, and hackers exploited that weakness, and the result was one of the largest breaches in history, exposing personal data of more than 140 million people. And that vulnerability itself was not really unusual, but what made it catastrophic was the failure to take responsibility. So being ethical is not only about avoiding bad behavior, it's about choosing responsibility even when it feels uncomfortable. Because sometimes that means you have to speak up when you see something wrong, even if no one else wants to deal with it. Other times it means slowing down to protect and do security testing when everyone else wants to rush ahead. So responsibility in IT is not passive, it's active. And it matters because real people depend on the systems that you build. So to wrap up, ethics in IT is not just about following the law, it's about trust, and it's about responsibility, and it's about thinking ahead to the ripple effects of your choices. And it may feel like your project in this course, is exempt from ethical considerations because it's only an academic exercise, but you need to remember that your work here is not purely theoretical. The solution that you design may one day be taken forward into actual production. And that means we have a responsibility, as we discussed, the responsibility of security, licensing, and proper use of access. They're not abstract, they're all valid, real-world considerations. There have been cases where academic prototype projects have had serious consequences once they escape the classroom. For example, Facebook's Open Graph started just as an internal project designed to experiment with integrating outside data, and it eventually grew into the platform that allowed Cambridge Analytica, a political consulting firm, to harvest data from tens of millions of users without their knowledge or consent. And what began as an experiment had a set of very real-world effects on politics, privacy, and trust in technology. So, as you work on your project this semester, keep in mind that what just seems like just for our class could easily find its way into wider use. The ethical choices that you make now are practice for the choices you'll face in your career. And one more thing, if you've ever been asked or pressured to do something that you know is unethical, bring that story. And you don't have to name names, but let's talk about it. And the more prepared you are to recognize these situations, the less likely you are to stumble in and be unprepared for what comes next.